Welcome to Night Light. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Night Light, a reminder that you are never alone.
I hope everyone had a great weekend, and we hope that the hurricane quickly fizzles out for our Florida friends. If you hear my desk collapse or computer blow up, you know David Brody is the guest, and he's got all this information just piled all over the desk. I can barely see the screen. But just a few weeks ago, you heard him on Coast to Coast, which was prep for a high-profile show like Nightlight. We'll be covering his last two novels, Sheba's Revenge and The Serpent Oracle, and segue into several of his other books. So I think this would be another career retrospective show of his research into out-of-place artifacts in America. And you can learn more about Dave by going to his website, davidbrodybooks.com. Hi, Dave. How you doing?
Good evening, Mark. Great to be with you again. Like you said, that was just a amateur hour for this big event here tonight. This is the big time.
Yeah.
Coast to Coast is nothing compared to your show. It's great.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll have to put that isolate that little clip and start each of the my shows with that. Thank you. We probably I don't know. We start off with maybe the Serpent Oracle. And that's the most recent one, and I think we can just kind of weave a lot of these artifacts and ideas into some of your earlier books, and maybe read a few passages from some other ones, and make for some really fascinating points for the listeners. And I think we're going to have a really exciting show tonight. Okay, so we just look at the title of your last book, The Serpent Oracle. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's since you're on with us on a regular basis, probably realize okay, there's probably something about snake symbolism throughout world religions. So sounds like a pretty easy starting point. That's what it is. I mean, it really was a very sort of simple observation that I had one day, which was that,
in modern times, we are taught that the snake, that the serpent, is the symbol of evil. That it's the devil's tool. But as I've done research over the past 15 years, looking at all this stuff, more and more I came to realize that in ancient times, people worshiped the snake, worshiped the serpent as a symbol of wisdom and of maybe being the tool of God, not the tool of the devil, and of rebirth, and so how did at one point was something of reverence turn into something that we now fear and abhor, and why is that? And going back in time, what was it about the snake and the serpent that made the ancient peoples worship it? I mean, I was just those kinds of questions are the kinds of things that I love to go down a rabbit hole and crawl around down there and try to figure it out. So that was, like you said, it was a very simple question to begin with. What's up with the snake? Why did it go from good to evil?
Right, and you give us a lot of examples, the cobra in Egypt, the staircase. That's at Chichen Itza, is that right? In Mexico?
No, it's not Chichen Itza. It's in Cucuban. So it's that's not Chichen Itza. But no, you've you caught me off guard. You're right. It is Chichen Itza. The Cucuban Pyramid. It is Chichen Itza. Yes, you're right.
Oh, okay.
Cucuban.
Yes. In the side of the staircase gets illuminated on the like summer solstice or something, and it shows a snake. And let's see, you do make observation about the Kundalini, and there's kind of snake imagery there, and it goes into goddess worship. So we have all these different interpretations of what the snake meant to different cultures and groups' ideologies.
Right. So it goes back, I think, even earlier to that. So I think what's going on here, Mark, and I can't swear to this, but I think what's going on is a lot of the ancient cultures had this belief that the gods were serpent-like. Now, whether that is because there were ancient aliens who were serpent-like aliens who came down and mated with humans, and that's where that came from, or whether it was something else, I can't say. The Sumerians have these origin legends about people, the Anunnaki, meaning those who from heaven came, and they came down and mated, and the Book of Genesis 6:1-2 has this whole passage about the sons of God came and mated with the human women, and are they really sons of God that came down, or were they angels, or were they some kind of aliens coming from the heavens? And that, but what we see is a lot of the ancient cultures had, and probably the most vivid example of that is an image. I think I sent it to you, Mark. I don't know if you were able to post it, but it's the one at the museum in Iraq of the city of Ur. It was found. This serpentine, it's half human, and the head is like a snake head, and that was one of their gods. And so this idea that the ancient gods are half human and half snake, is sort of a natural extension of the idea that aliens came down who were serpentine in appearance and mated with humans, and the result of that, those offspring were the nobility, the royal class, or whatever. So that's just speculation, but we see interesting evidence because around the globe, in 6 or 7 different cultures I've been able to identify, we have this practice of people's binding the skulls of their infants to elongate the skulls and make the skulls and the eyes appear more serpentine. So we have it with the Mayans. We have it with, for example, the Queen Nefertiti. We have it in even up until around World War II in southern France. We have it on the Isle of Malta. We have it in Mesopotamia. It's one of these things that it's sort of around the world. this common practice of ancient peoples, like even using these boards to squish the skulls of their babies, again, to elongate them, to make the eyes appear more slanty. This also caused physiological changes that allow the children to have hallucinations and visions, and therefore to be sort of, quote unquote, more in touch with the gods. But I think all this is evidence of this idea that the serpent and the snake were powerful and worth venerating and worth emulating, because, of course, we always want to emulate our gods.
And you do have the snake handling church in Appalachia. Okay, that's okay. That.
And that's of course much more modern, and that's actually that's a reflection of the idea that snakes are evil. So now we're back to since the New Testament, the whole Adam and Eve story, which obviously is the Old Testament, but the whole idea that the devil used the snake to tempt Eve, and again the snake was a symbol of forbidden knowledge. God didn't want humans to have knowledge for whatever reason. But now we have in more modern times the idea of the snake being a negative thing, an evil thing. And these churches in Appalachia, and this goes on still to this day, even though there have been laws passed in most of the Appalachian states prohibiting it. We're talking Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, the Carolinas. People go into these churches and they handle poisonous snakes, usually rattlesnakes, and the idea is that the snake is the tool of the devil, but if your faith is strong enough, you can lift this snake, and sometimes people literally go, chin to chin with these snakes, or they wrap them around their necks, but the idea is if your faith is strong enough, God will protect you from these bites, protect you from the devil. And the reality is people die every year from these snake bites, because once you get bitten, then it becomes a situation where everyone surrounds you and prays for you to be healed. So then it becomes a test of the faith of the entire congregation. And although if you want, they will take you to a hospital to be cured, there's a lot of peer pressure not to do that, to instead let the congregation cure you with prayer and song and faith. Again, the reality is people die from this every year. But that's more of a modern representation of the snake being the devil, and our faith in God should be enough to overcome that.
Yeah, and it's actually at the end of the Book of Mark, and
you just quote that because you like the
name. I guess I was probably named after it. But it does say that he who believes and is baptized will be saved, and he who does not believe will be condemned. There are these signs that will be associated with believers. In my name they will cast out devils. They will have the gift of tongues. They will pick up snakes in their hands and be unharmed. Should they drink deadly poison, they will lay their hands on the sick who will recover. So that goes back to whenever the book with Mark was written, was like 60, 60 AD or something. I'm just trying to find it real fast.
So you mentioned poison. They also take strychnine, and they also talk about talking in tongues. So you see that as well. But some of them, are injured or even killed from the strychnine as well. But that's not quite as visual a thing as watching someone. What they do is they all start dancing and singing, and then they have a bag of snakes. And of course, because of the church, they generally bathe the snakes first, because they don't want dirty snakes coming into the church. They want clean snakes because it's the house of God. But then they dump the snakes out onto the floor, and people pick them up one at a time, and they again wrap them around their necks, wrap them around their arms, hold them up in the air, pray with them, dance with them, whatever. And they're not defanged or anything. These are poisonous snakes, and inevitably people get bit. So yes, there is taking of poisons as well, the same kind of test of faith, but that's not quite as dramatic, and doesn't get the National Geographic documentary that the snake handling does. And people can find these on the internet. They're very easy to find. If you just Google that, you'll be able to watch these videos, and it's really pretty compelling stuff to watch these people actually handle these snakes and sometimes get bit.
Okay, yeah. So, you return to an Appalachian setting like you did for Pillars of Enoch, but for some of your prep for this book, you went to the Serpent Mound in Ohio.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So
field trip.
Sure. You had started this interview off by talking about ancient cultures worshiping the serpent. You had talked about the descending serpent illumination at Chichen Itza, like you said, on the equinox. The shadows form this serpent and Kukulkan, pardon me. And there's a bunch of different examples of serpent worship around the world. I was a little bit surprised to see evidence of it in the Ohio River Valley. I know that the Native Americans, the Indians in the Southwest, have a tradition of serpent worship, but there's a fascinating mound. It's about a quarter-mile long, and it's a serpent, it's a snake, in southern Ohio, about 45 minutes or so south of Columbus and about 45 minutes east of Cincinnati. So southern Ohio. It's called the Serpent Mound. Some people think the snake, the serpent, has an egg in its mouth, but that's sort of in dispute. And this dates back to, again, the carbon dating is inconclusive. It's either about 1,000 years ago or about 2,000 years ago. So it's a Dina, Hopewell culture. Again, unclear exactly how old, but it's clearly pre-contact. But the idea is that these the Native Americans in the area, were worshiping the serpent. Unclear exactly why. One of the possibilities, right next to the mound, is an impact site from a crater, and it may be that meteorite, which was much older than the dates I just gave. It goes back millions of years, probably.
Yeah. It was like 30 million years or so. It was long ago.
So it may be, and this explanation doesn't exactly fit because it's too far back for human memory, but some people think that the meteorite came out of the night sky, came out of the constellation Draco, and that the peoples then built the Serpent Mound to honor the snake, the Draco constellation, which is where the meteorite came out of. And again, literally, the impact spot is right on the edge of the Serpent Mound here. So there's some problems with that theory. Again, there weren't humans old enough around back then to know this, so it doesn't exactly fit. But there's also, it's a little bit weird because there's not a lot of other evidence of serpent worship, snake worship, in that area of America. So I'm not quite sure what that's doing there. And so, again, one of the possibilities is, was there some kind of culture that came in from the Mediterranean, from the Middle East? Again, we know there was lots of serpent worship back then there that maybe came across to the Americas, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, pre-Columbus, pre-Viking, pre-any of that, were there Mediterranean or Middle Eastern explorers who came across. And so that's one of the possibilities I explore in my book. And that, in turn, I know you want to get to this, that ties into the history laid out in the Book of Mormon about how Middle Eastern explorers came over here, about 2,400 years ago, and those timelines sort of jive a little bit. So that's one of the possibilities, is that the Serpent Mound in Ohio ties into the history laid out in the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so one of the topics you explore in the Serpent Oracle is that the Ohio Valley might be the setting for large portions of the Book of Mormon instead of the traditional view that the Book of Mormon was set in the Yucatan area of Mexico. So, your one of your characters is interested in seeing if there's some validity to that theory.
So, and I'm not an expert on the Book of Mormon by any stretch, but as you said, one of my characters in the story is of the Mormon faith, and she happens to be terminally ill from cancer, and she wants to sort of get answers to the things that she's been taught since she was a kid, and so she goes on sort of a final quest in her life and wants to find out some answers to this. So one of the questions she asks is, in the Book of Mormon, there's this whole thing about a battle between the Nephites and the Lamanites, and as you said, Mark, traditionally that is thought of as taking place in Mesoamerica, in the Yucatan Peninsula area. But there is a group of Mormon scholars, and Wayne May is probably one of the names that most people associate this with. He publishes Ancient American Magazine. Wayne believes that that area called Land Bountiful, where the Nephites and Lamanites fought, is actually in the Ohio River Valley, south of the Great Lakes. And he points to a lot of the fortifications that are there in that area, the Serpent Mound, of course, something called Fortified Hill, which is in Cincinnati, the Newark Earthworks, the Great Circle Mound. There's a lot of interesting fortification-like mounds and construction in that area that do fit the description in the Book of Mormon about the kinds of forts that the people back then that built, the Nephites built. And Wayne goes into it pretty deeply. I don't need to go into as much detail as he does, but it's an interesting argument, and it has not been widely accepted amongst Mormon scholars, but it does get some play. And I've visited many of these fortification sites, and they're fascinating. They really are. They don't sort of fit what you would, if you were to see them in Europe, you'd have no doubt that they were, Roman or something. They really don't look, quote unquote, Indian. Not that Indians couldn't have done stuff like this, but there's just not a lot of evidence that they did. These sites seem to be outliers of some kind, and Wayne tries to put the pieces together and say, okay, well, what are they? If they're not Indian, if they're not Native American, what else could they be? And they fit very neatly into the Book of Mormon history from about that same time period. That time period, again, we're talking, a few hundred years before Christ to a few hundred years after Christ. That range in there, maybe 500 BC to 300 AD, in that range is generally what we're talking there.
The Book of Mormon is a frequently overlooked sacred book, but I'm not a scholar of it either. I've read a little bit about it. Watched some of Wayne's captivating videos. I'm reading from. I did a little bit of prep work for tonight's show by reading T.J. O'Brien's Fair Gods and Feather Serpents. And T.J. writes, as a background to why he, meaning Jesus, would visit the New World, Mormons quote the Bible passage in John given by Christ to his followers while he was yet in Palestine. And he says, and other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, that them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. That's John chapter 10, verses 14. The whole passage is 14 to 16. But it's not abundantly clear.
It's pretty weak, if you ask me. That's a pretty generous reading of that passage, I would have to say, Mark. To be honest, sorry to criticize your source there, but I think that's a stretch.
But yeah, there's other parts in the Book of Mormon about the use. If we can look at like some of the Jaredites and is it Lamanites? Is that the right?
Yeah, Lamanites and Nephites. Yeah, and there's also
different groups of people. There's some evidence that it really does sound like. Are we using different terms for the Adena and Hopewell people that Barbara and I have a bunch of scholars of those two different cultures on our show, and sitting there going through some of Wayne's videos, and you get the use of pearls, and the Hopewell used them in place them in burials with some of the prominent people of the village.
Well, and also don't forget things like the Hanukkah fort in Ohio.
Yeah.
There's a fortification that's shaped like a Hanukkah menorah. So and a time frame. Not to mention the Decalogue stone, and there's a bunch of different artifacts and sites in the Ohio River Valley that go back to the Middle East. There's Hebrew writing, there's Hebrew artifacts, and they go back to right around that same time period, 2,000 or 2,500 years ago, right around the same time as the Book of Mormon events are taking place. And remember, the Book of Mormon talks about how the whole thing starts when a group of a family of people from Israel come eventually to America. So that, and I forget the guy's name. I should know. That I don't. I apologize. But that starts out about 600 BC, and they make their way to America, and really the stories of these families. But what Wayne is doing, and I think it's good research. He's looking at these anomalous sites, the Hebrew carvings, the fortifications, all the different things in the Ohio River Valley, and saying, this doesn't make sense with what we know about Native American history, so maybe there's an outside influence here. And I think if you look at, and you started to make this point earlier, Mark, if you look at the Book of Mormon as a potential historical reference, I'm not saying that everything in there is accurate, because there's a lot of things that are religious in nature that I don't necessarily agree with, but just the basic story about people coming over here during that time period and having wars and building fortifications, whatever, just that part of it. Maybe there's some truth to that, even if you don't believe in the entire religion. And so, so I think that's where I come. How I come at it is there are things I don't understand about the anomalous sites and anomalous artifacts in that Ohio River Valley area that don't make sense to me. And there's a story told in the Book of Mormon that helps explain those things. And so maybe we can put the two of those together, marry those two things together, and help us understand things a little better. So that's how I look at this. Not to say that it's definitive, but I think we need to look at the possibility. And Wayne has done a nice job sort of opening our eyes to those possibilities.
Oh, yeah, I think so too. And he talks about in the Book of Ether, the people were working in copper and other metals and ores. The Hopewell did that. The use of head plates, maybe some of the huge bodies of water. Since we're talking about Ohio, a huge body of water could be just the nearby Great Lakes.
Right.
So, I mean, the geography, it's not really super specific, but if you put all these traits in general geographic descriptions on top of the Midwest, Ohio, it's like this is actually kind of makes sense that the sacred book could be set in the Ohio River Valley instead of Mexico. It is a very thought-provoking theory.
Well, and I don't want to get I don't want to lose the thread we started on, which was the Serpent Mound itself in southern Ohio, which it's unfortunately there's some political thing going on here, but it was on a preliminary list to become a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a fascinating site, and my wife and I did the drive out from Boston just this past April, and it was well worth the trip. It was a 14-hour drive, but again, it was really just an amazing site to see, and I would encourage all your listeners to get out there to southern Ohio and check it out. But the thing about it is it just doesn't fit anything else that's going on in that area. In fact, it was only recently that the Native American tribes in the area even sort of laid claim to it or embraced it as their own. Again, for a long time, even they didn't really understand what it was or recognize it as being part of their heritage. And the Native Americans are very, very zealous in protecting their heritage, as they should be, but not in this particular case. And I think it may be because they didn't really have a memory of it and didn't have a history of it because it doesn't fit. It's like there's something else going on there. And so when I see something like that, it makes me go, if the Native Americans, for whatever reason, 100 years ago didn't recognize it as part of their culture, maybe it's not. Maybe there's something else going on with that. We have a site like that, and very near and dear to your heart. I know the American Stonehenge site in Salem, New Hampshire. I know you've had Dennis Stone on many times, and people say, it's a Native American site, and yet I go up there 4 or 5 times a year for equinoxes, for solstices, for whatever, and there's almost never any Native American presence there. And I've talked to Native American tribal leaders in the area, and they say, hey, that's a neat site, but we didn't do that. Like, we have no memory of that. That's not part of our heritage. We have, that's not one of our sites. Not to say we couldn't have done that. We just didn't. And so if they say they didn't do it, like, who am I to say they did? And that's the problem with some of these. We try to pigeonhole these things. Well, it wasn't the colonists, because we know that scientifically. It's older than that. It must be the Native Americans. Well, no, they say we didn't do it. So now we're left with a third choice, which is, again, some kind of European or Mediterranean or African or Asian or some kind of other group of seafarers who came across the oceans, and we didn't know about it. We don't know about it today, therefore it couldn't have happened. And I'm like, well, hold on one second. If it's not colonial and it's not Native American, it must be one of these other groups. And just because we don't know about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Let's go look at it and try to figure out what did happen. So that's the same analysis we're making in America's Stonehenge, and that applies also to the Serpent Mound site in Ohio. It's too old to be colonial. It's obviously not colonial. The colonists would do stuff like that. The Native Americans didn't really embrace that site for a long time, so there's a question about whether it's theirs. So what's the third possibility? Is there another possibility? You mentioned Wayne May's research. Maybe it's the Book of Mormon story. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's related to the copper culture, where I think the ancient Phoenicians may have come across to the Great Lakes to trade for and mine copper, and maybe they did something like that. Because, again, the Phoenicians were from the part of the world that was serpent worshiping. So maybe that's related to them. Maybe not, but maybe. So, again, these are the areas of inquiry I think we need to be a little more zealous and open-minded about making.
Okay, and you just mentioned the Decalogue stone and the Hanukkah fort.
Yes.
So how that asks us to think about, so how did Native people know Jewish traditions?
Right. So the Decalogue stone is about the size of a channel remote, channel clicker, and it has a picture of Moses carved on it. We know it's Moses because it has his name above him and written in Hebrew, and it has the Ten Commandments around the rim of it. And it was found in a burial mound not too far from the Newark earthworks, Newark, Ohio. And what we know about, which is really helpful, because it was found on a wooden platform, resting on a wooden platform, and the platform itself was carbon dated to about 100 A.D. So this fits in really nicely, again, with the Book of Mormon stuff, because that's right around the time frame of those stories. But it also fits in with, perhaps I wrote a book called Romerica, where I postulate that there might have been Roman era explorers, probably related to the ancient Phoenicians, who came to America right around that same time period, and made their way to the Ohio River Valley. And again, they would have had knowledge of Hebrew, which is where the Hebrew writing comes in. But clearly the Native Americans at 100 A.D. were not speaking Hebrew and carving Hebrew. That just doesn't make any sense. And then nearby there was something you just mentioned, the Ohio Hanukkah fort. Again, it's an earthwork, so earth mounds, earth embankments built up, but it's in the shape of, it's basically a combination of a menorah, which is a 9-stemmed candelabra, which is used to celebrate the Hanukkah festival in Judaism, and also a oil lamp, which also is part of the Hanukkah festival, because the story goes the Hanukkah miracle is that there was only enough oil in the temple to light the lamp for 1 day and burn for 8 days, which is why the Hanukkah candle is 8 days plus 1. Anyway, there's the fort is shaped like a lamp and a menorah together. It's just a very unique design, and again, not something that the Native Americans would have any reason to do. And of course, we know it's too old to be colonial, so who could have done this? Clearly, there is some kind of Old Testament Jewish influence there. Had to be somebody who had knowledge of Old Testament stories and spoke Hebrew in order to have done these things. Who was it? We don't know. What are the possibilities? Okay, let's get into it. What are the possibilities? And it's that second question, what are the possibilities, that so many or so few mainstream historians and archaeologists are willing to ask those questions. Instead, they say things like, well, it must be a fake. Well, it must be, a hoax. Well, it must not really be an oil lamp and a menorah. It must be something else. When if you take a look at it, even a 6-year-old kid will say, oh, that's a menorah, that's an oil lamp. I mean, it's not that hard to see, and yet we can't seem to get mainstream historians and academic types to even ask any of these questions. And that's a little bit frustrating, but anyway, so I apologize for that little diatribe, that little tangent. But the artifacts are there, and they tell a story, and I think it's our job to try to figure out what that story is.
Okay, and I don't know if there's one of the themes in your Serpent Oracle is the theme of the two hills, the Butler County hill fort with the maze-like entrance. That's in Squire and Davis's book, and the hill Kumara that was the final battle in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
So,
and that's one of the big pieces of evidence one of the big arguments Wayne May makes, and I think it's very compelling, is that the final battle, which most scholars believe happened in the Yucatan, was supposedly near the hill Cumorah, which we know is in upstate New York. And Wayne's point is, well, how can it can't be both? He can't be close to the hill Cumorah and be in the Yucatan. And that's why he says, well, maybe it wasn't in the Yucatan, maybe it was in the Ohio River Valley, which is not all that far from upstate New York. So there we go. So that's another part of his argument is just look at the common sense geography, and the Yucatan location seems odd, being thousands of miles from Hucamara.
And that's where the hill Cumorah is where Joseph Smith found the copper tablets. So
exactly.
There are some artifacts associated with that. So it really is a lot of interesting aspects of America's prehistory that you delve into that a lot of mainstream people probably aren't going to acknowledge that, but there's something that the I's needed to be dotted. There's some information out there that just leaves us feeling like this gap is really bothering me, that we just can't fill it.
Mark, you said the I's need to be dotted. I would say the I's need to be opened. I would say that we need people to open their eyes to this, and I come at this. You know this, but maybe some of your listeners don't. I'm a lawyer by trade, so I've been practicing law for 35 years. My training is in evidence. So I was taught early on as a law student, hey, look, if there's evidence in a case, if there's a table full of evidence, you can't just pick and choose which evidence you want to use, because if there's evidence that is against you, you can be damn sure the other side is going to bring it up in front of the jury. So you better have an explanation for it. You can't just stick your head in the sand and say, oh, we're going to ignore those fingerprints. We're going to ignore, whatever it is. You need to have an explanation for every piece of evidence in the case, and it has to be consistent with your theory of the case. And so here we are, and we have artifacts, the Serpent Mound, the fortifications, the Decalogue, so whatever it is, we have things that are there, and we have science behind them to tell us how old they are, who built them, whatever. And yet we have versions of history that ignore these pieces of evidence and don't take them into account. And to me, that just doesn't work. That's that's being intellectually dishonest. That you can't tell a story that leaves some of the pieces of evidence out. That's not a complete story. So that's why I go back to say we have to open our eyes to this stuff. There has to be an explanation for it. You're just not allowed to leave that stuff out and just say, put my Sergeant Schultz, right, on the Hogan's Hero. I know nothing. That doesn't work. That works in a sitcom. It doesn't work in history.
Okay, so the subtitle of the Serpent Oracle is Templars, Mormons, and the Lilith Legacy. How does Lilith fit into the Serpent Oracle?
Yeah, so Lilith's a great character, a great person in history. It's sort of in many ways she embodies that whole idea behind are snakes good or evil? So Lilith, for those listeners who may not know, Adam had a wife before Eve, Lilith. People don't realize that. So Lilith was the first wife of Adam, and unfortunately for Adam, Lilith was also the first feminist. So she did things like wanting to be equal to Adam. Sexually, she wanted to be on top. Adam didn't like that. He wanted somebody who was very submissive, who was not assertive, and he complained to God, and he said, this Lilith, too much. I don't want this. I want, it's not what I want. So God said, okay, we're going to get rid of Lilith. We're going to send her down made her a demon, sent her back down to the underworld, and God created Eve. So that was Adam's second wife. And so Lilith, since then, has sort of been associated with wanton women who are sexually active. Usually pictures of her, she's portrayed with the snake, again, because she's associated with the underworld, with the devil. So oftentimes she's naked with a snake covering her private parts. In Judaism, there are legends of how Lilith will come during the night and cause men to have ejaculations, wet dreams, and so women would make these bowls, these pottery bowls, and carve into them an incantation telling Lilith to stay away, and then bury these bowls under the doorstep of their home to keep Lilith away from their husbands at night, okay? And also away from their babies, because Lilith was known to steal babies. But this whole association of Lilith as being demonic and stealing babies and stealing husbands, and association with the snake, all this goes back to the whole idea in Christianity that Eve was the preferred wife. She was submissive. What she did do wrong was she dared to seek the forbidden knowledge. We don't want women seeking knowledge. We want women to be sort of, you can turn to your husband if you want knowledge. You don't want you seeking it on your own. This whole idea, this whole tension between submissive women and the feminists of today, which is represented by Lilith. And so a lot of the modern day feminist movements have used Lilith and the snake by association as symbols of their movements. So Lilith is a fascinating character. The old TV sitcom with Cheers with Dr. Fraser Crane and his wife, who of course was a strong feminist. Her name was Lilith, and it was very aptly named. But I'm not sure if many people understood or know that Eve was Adam's second wife, not his first.
Yeah, and earlier, you mentioned the elongated skulls gave people hallucinations, and some people can have thought that John of Patmos was having hallucinations in the cave that produced the dictation of the Book of Revelation. So you get into like the Lilith legacy from Jewish folklore, and some of these other ideas of like spirituality.
Right, and I forgot to mention one thing about Lilith, and let me just jump in quickly. But the whole idea of Lilith haunting the families and stealing the babies and causing ejaculations in the husbands and stuff. There was an incantation, a Hebrew incantation, Lilu Abi Abi, meaning Lilith be gone. Lilu Abi Abi, lullaby. That's where the word lullaby comes from. Lilu Abi Abi, Lilith be gone, recited by Jewish mothers over an infant's cradle. And that's sort of a cool little piece of trivia. That's where the word lullaby comes from.
Cool. So
the Morticia Addams in Addams Family, the old Addams Family show, Morticia Addams, and she's dressed in black and she's very voluptuous, and we never really see her feet, but they're sort of serpent-like feet, snake-like feet. We don't really. She's sort of she's a Lilith-like character as well.
Okay. So, we don't need to reenact Gomez's response if she speaks French on the show.
I was at a town meeting once. This is a total segue, and there was a guy who just was making a complete idiot of himself, and one of us said, Uncle Fester can put a light bulb in his head and in his mouth and make it light up. And that doesn't make him a scientist any more than it makes you a scientist, because you can say blah, 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 blah. And it was a great Uncle Fester put down. Just because he can put a light bulb in his mouth doesn't make him a scientist. And
I like it.
Good Addams Family talk. That's always a good thing for a talk show.
Yeah, and there's actually a Lurch festival. You ought to come down for that and work that into another like Appalachian section of your book. I think it's in Philippi, West Virginia.
Wasn't he in the movie? He was a judge in that movie, My Cousin Vinny, right?
No, that was Herman Munster.
Oh, was that Herman Munster? Okay.
Yeah.
I stand corrected. Munster is not the Addams Family. You're right. I think it was.
Yeah. There's there is a Lurch festival. I think it was early, in the spring. It's I don't know. I just really irritated myself, and I'm going to have to look it up while we're doing something else. But
So let me say one more point, because we got off the topic, and I want to make this point, that the idea of this conflict between the snake being good and evil, in modern times we think of it as being pretty evil, and yet the rod of Asclepius, a symbol of the American Medical Association, even today there are still vestiges of people understanding that the snake represents wisdom, and so in ancient times that was very well accepted. Today, not so much, but the Medical Association still has that. And I also found interesting, and again, in Freemasonry, the symbolism is always a couple layers down deep, but found some interesting symbolism in Freemasonry. For example, there's a one of their rituals has to do with the brazen serpent, which is a story in the Old Testament of how the Israelites were misbehaving, and so many of them were bitten by snakes. But God said, if you were bitten by the snake, if you look upon the serpent that I put on the pole, you won't die. And so the serpent was a symbol of God's power and God's mercy. So again, it wasn't negative; it was positive. And there's a brazen serpent ritual in Freemasonry. And also, and this was really cool, and I use this in the story itself, there's a rogue group of Freemasons, who want to go back to the older, stricter kind of Freemasonry. This group started in the Philippines and then spread to the West Coast, and they're called the Grand and Glorious Order of the Knights of the Creeping Serpent. The Creeping Serpent. So they adopted the old names of some of these, the Knights of the Creeping Serpent. I thought that was really interesting too, that they went back to the snake as their symbol.
Yeah, more of a traditional. And you do have fundamentalist might be a better term I could have used. But you do have branches that want to return to the basics. So that's characteristic for spiritually aware groups.
Right. You have that. Every group has that. Every group, there's going to be tension between modernizing. Do we want to let women in? Do we want to let minorities in? Do we want to open up, to the people more transparent to the public, or do we want to go back to the old ways of just, limited membership, closed doors, strict rules, hazing, whatever. So every group goes through that, and this particular group, they wanted to be more conservative. They have hazing. They had stricter rituals. But again, as I said before, in Freemasonry, things are always a couple levels below the surface. In my mind, the fact that they chose to call themselves the Knights of the Creeping Serpent, the snake, I thought was meaningful.
Okay, and I did find the website for Lurch Fest.
Okay.
It was held on August 6th. On Museum Street in Philippi, West Virginia, all celebrating Philippi's native son Ted Cassidy, best known for his role as Lurch in the 1960s TV show The Addams Family. So there
we go.
You can Google it. Still, number of different websites pop up, but that's all. I guess it would be like about the first weekend of August. So get some people there. Get there for next year. but I enjoyed the Serpent Oracle. I don't want to give away the whole book, but there are you do have some Templar information in there.
Right. So the Templar, I always I mentioned that the Freemasons that everything is sort of below the surface, and that they're a good sort of litmus test for what some of the secret beliefs are. The Templars also, because they're a secret society as well. This whole idea that the ancient peoples believed in the union of some kind of alien serpent space traveling group mating with the humans. When I talked about the figurine that was at the museum in Iraq, which is the snake face and the human body. There's another representation of that the Templars, and people, your listeners probably know, the Templars were basically a secret organization, warrior monks for about 200 years, from the early 1100s to the early 1300s. They were basically the army of the church, but they were not only warriors, they were religious, so an interesting combination. And many people believe that the Freemasons, after the Templars were outlawed in 1307, that they went underground and reconstituted themselves as the Freemasons, and that group carries forward the traditions and secrets of Templarism. But the Templars, as a secret group, we don't know a lot about them. And then within the Templars, they had secret seals that they used for their communications. And some of those seals have survived. One of the secret seals is something called the symbol of Abraxas, Abraxas, which is a Greek word, and each of those letters is the first letter of one of the planets in the solar system. The point is that it's the Gnostic group in France. These are an offshoot of Christianity. The Gnostics worshipped Abraxas as a pagan god that they believe was superior even to Yahweh, even to God. They believe Abraxas created Yahweh, and of course Yahweh is the father of Jesus and the God that we pray to in Judeo-Christianity. But they believe there was a higher being called Abraxas. But they believed Abraxas was half, and this is finally my point, was half human and half snake. So they had snake legs and a human body, and also, by the way, a rooster head. They'll put that aside for a second. But again, we're back to Morticia Addams in the Addams Family, or a mermaid, perhaps. But the idea that the gods were half human and half serpent. So that's a pagan belief, and eventually the Gnostics were wiped out by the Catholic Church in something called the Albigensian Crusade in the early 1200s. For being the wrong kind of Christians, for worshiping this Abraxas pagan deity, the wrong god. But the Templars secretly use Abraxas on one of their seals. And so to me, when I see something like that, well, why would the Templars glorify and venerate something like that unless they also believed it? They believed this whole idea that the ancient gods were not just human, but they were half snake, half serpent. That's the symbolism of the Abraxas. The Templars, again, being, even though they were the church of, the army of the church, they were good Christians. That's what they were. But they still use this secret seal. So to me, that speaks volumes. And there has to be a reason for that.
Mm-hmm. I maybe take a sample from your book, Romerica, where I think there are a bunch of coins that were found in the Ohio River Valley between 200 and 300 AD.
Mostly in that range, right around 200 AD. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and
also found, by the way, along the Atlantic coast in New England. Same dates, by the way.
Okay, so there you have isolated discoveries of coins around the same time period, and you do have other examples in your books. It's like so around 600 BC is when Lehi left Jerusalem to come to North America.
Thank you. The first, yes, the Book of Mormon. Lehi is his name. Thank you for getting that. Thank you.
Yeah. So when you are outlining your book, or whatever book you're working on, when you start seeing something happened here, and let's just say Jerusalem at this time, and 10 years later, all of a sudden we find Hebrew writing for the very first time in this other location. It's so long ago, and we don't really have exact documents, surviving documentation that the Hebrew people left here and went here, but there's like, okay, this kind of makes sense. You give them a little bit of time to get reestablished elsewhere. A little migration pattern going on. Nothing in the Hebrew written language predates this one artifact. So when you're outlining a book and you come across examples like that, there's a consistency in time periods. How do you approach that? To make a point, propel your story forward.
So it's interesting you brought that up in the context of the book Romerica, because Romerica is a book, it's about Roman-era artifacts right around the year 200 AD, all across America. And it's a book I resisted writing for a long time because when I do my research, I come across, you called them earlier, out-of-place artifacts. And I have a file, and I add to my file. And after a while, the file that was dating to around 200 AD was getting thicker and thicker and thicker, to the point where there were artifacts like all over the Ohio River Valley and New England, and they all clustered right around that same date. And it seemed like every time there was an artifact that we somebody came across, they would do carbon dating, or they would do some kind of luminescence testing, or whatever the scientific test was. A coin itself has a date on it. That's easy. All the dates are coming back right around that time period. And finally, I'm like, you know what? There's just too much of this to ignore. This goes back to what I said earlier. You can't just ignore the evidence. The evidence has to drive the story. You can't start with the story and then look for evidence. You got to start with the evidence and then look for the story behind it. So there has to be some kind of story behind all these different artifacts. And so I resisted for a long time the Romerica book. And in the end, when I finally did sit down and write it, and I think I told you this before, Mark, it was the quickest book I ever wrote. It took me literally 101 days from start to finish to write that book, which normally takes me twice that time, at least twice as long. But that book had been building up in me for so long because of all the artifacts I kept finding and wondering about them. And when I finally sat down, it whoosh, just sort of came out of me. But, you know, it's not always that easy. But there were so many, not just artifacts dating back to that time period, but then historical events. So, for example, the Bar Kokhba uprising in Jerusalem is 132 A.D. Don't quote me exactly. It's right around that time period.
Okay.
But that was right around the same time. So if all these Hebrew-related artifacts are here during that time period, why? Well, you have a huge migration. It's called the diaspora out of Jerusalem. Once the Romans put down the uprising, they basically, the Jews were either enslaved or exiled or killed. And so the Jews left, and, you know, where did they go? They went all over the world. Well, maybe some of them found their way across the Atlantic, and that's why we have that would be the historical event that would explain how all these artifacts dated around that same time period ended up in America. And so, you know, you start putting the pieces together, and you're like, you know, I may not have the story exactly right, but there is a story there, and, you know, I think my version of it's plausible, at least. I might have some of it wrong, but, you know, this goes back to what I said earlier. We can't just ignore all these sites and artifacts. There's history behind those, and we can't just say, oh, they're fakes, they're hoaxes, it's just a coincidence. That's lazy, and it's also, I think, intellectually disingenuous.
Okay, it's just with so many people writing now, and a lot of people might be wrapping up books that they wrote during 2 years of all the pandemic craziness. Just trying to give people ideas on how other professional writers go about crafting their stories, to the point where, I think all your books are they really pull you into the story and have these interesting artifacts that are real. But then you overlay the story with Cam getting. You usually have someone being blackmailed. You're really good at crafting how someone gets blackmailed.
Yeah, that's my old lawyer background with sort of the legal ramifications of some of the stuff, or like you said, blackmail, or some kind of
compromise,
real estate twist sometimes. But what you said at the beginning of that question, I think is very important, which is the artifacts. To me, the most compelling thing about the stories that I write are the artifacts. And I'm one of the few fiction writers that I know that includes pictures of the artifacts in the story, because I want to make it clear to the readers that these are real artifacts. The Serpent Mound in Ohio is a real mound.
I've been there, yeah.
Yeah, the tower in Rhode Island, the Newport Tower, is a real tower. So if I write about an artifact, it's real, and the things I say about it historically are accurate. Now, the story that I tell behind the characters, you mentioned Cameron and other characters, obviously that's fiction. But I think the thing that makes my books and I think the reason they've been successful is people are fascinated by the fact that they're real artifacts and real sites, and there is a real history behind the fiction. So it's, some people call it faction. It's factually based fiction. But for anybody who's out there looking to do something like this, if you can find real artifacts as opposed to making them up, that's better, because now half your story's told, because people are naturally curious about, hey, wait, there's a fort shaped like a menorah in Ohio. Well, what the heck is that doing there? Right away, people are interested in that, as opposed to creating something out of the blue that people are like, oh, that's sort of a cool plot, but I know it's not real.
Yeah, the Decalogue stone is on display, and go there and make up your own mind.
Yeah, we stopped there on the way. We stopped there on the way down to see the Serpent Mound in Ohio. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been to the Johnson Humbrick.
Good for you. Yeah, Johnson something with an H. Humbrick House. Yeah, I know. A nice little museum. Very nice.
Yeah, and they have lots of other really nice displays of Central American and
a lot of Hopewell culture stuff there too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they had some Kachina dolls. So it was really a well done display. But, with your Sheba's Revenge,
Humrick House, Johnson Humrick House Museum in Coshocton, Ohio. There we go. Mm-hmm. I want to give out a shout out. They were a nice little museum. Johnson Humrick House Museum, Coshocton, Ohio. You can see not only the Decalogue stone, but also other Adena Hopewell culture items and other things as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you have a sample of ruins of the canals, what's the name of the canal that went through the area? I think that's part of the park. It's really,
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, but in your Sheba's Revenge, let's get a little background on.
We're going to switch. All right, we're going to switch. I want to make one more comment about the serpent stuff. We've talked. I mentioned the America Stonehenge site in New Hampshire. Again, near and dear to your heart, Mark.
Yeah.
There's also some snake walls there that Dennis has discovered recently. They did some LiDAR imaging, which basically allows you to see the landscape without the trees. So you just see the stones, and you can see these amazing snake stone walls that sort of begin and end for no reason whatsoever, which makes him think, and I happen to agree, that there probably was serpent worship going on there as well. So not just the Serpent Mound in Ohio, but some fascinating serpent walls in southern New Hampshire as well.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to see how the research on those develop, and is there some kind of connection between Dennis's serpentine walls and the Serpent Mound and other places in Alabama? So it's interesting to contemplate. With Sheba's Revenge, the listeners can also go to Barbara's homepage and look at her movie Secrets of the Stones, and there's some
great. It's a great documentary. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, the serpentine walls there that she and Patrick filmed. But okay, to refresh our listeners' memories on who is Sheba, let's get a little background on that story.
Right. So so Sheba's Revenge is the latest. It's the 14th in my series of Templars in America books. It's called Sheba's Revenge, Oak Island, and the Templar Treasure. But Sheba was I would say mythical, but not mythical. I think most historians recognize her as being a real historical figure. So the story behind Sheba is that she was described as bold, brilliant, and beautiful, a queen of Ethiopia, or that area. It may have been some neighboring areas, but in that general area, northern, eastern coast of Africa. So at one point during the time of King Solomon, so in the 9th century BC, so she traveled north to visit the famous King Solomon. And apparently at the time she did, she was a virgin. Apparently that was part of the tradition of her country, was that the queen remained a virgin. Now, I don't know how she ended up having heirs, if that was the case, but for whatever reason, she was still a virgin. And he had sort of a crush on her, but she made him promise not to try to seduce her. But he tricked her. Basically what happened was he threw a big banquet for her on her last night, and the food was filled with spices and salt. And he had made her promise not to steal anything from her when she was visiting, in exchange for his promise not to try to seduce her. So she woke up in the middle of the night very thirsty from the spicy, salty food, and grabbed a jug of water, which in the dark she did not see was labeled property of King Solomon. And she drank the water, and he was waiting in the shadows and said, "Aha, you stole my water, therefore I'm no longer bound by my promise not to try to seduce you." And so he seduced her, and she became pregnant. Maybe he raped her, I don't know, but she became pregnant. 20 years later, the son of that union, named Melanick, returned to Jerusalem to meet his father. And Solomon, to his credit, welcomed him and actually asked him to stay and rule by his side. Menelik declined because he said, "I need to go back to Ethiopia and rule there." And so Solomon offered the sons of his top advisors to accompany Melanick. So basically the sons of the cabinet figures he offered to Menelik sort of as the junior, that they could grow old and wise with Melanick, and to go back to Ethiopia to help him rule. The sons were not happy about that. They didn't want to be sent away from Jerusalem. They were happy. They didn't want to go to the backwaters of Ethiopia. And so they decided to conspire to steal the Ark of the Covenant as they were departing. And so off they went, and Menelik did not know about that, but they took the Ark of the Covenant, and at some point Solomon learned of the theft, and he gave chase. And there's a fascinating book called the Kibra Nagast, which is basically the history of Ethiopia. And the Kibra Nagast describes this escape in great detail. And the point basically is that Solomon does not catch them, that they end up back in Ethiopia. And I think, and to this day, many scholars believe that the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia, at a place called Aksum, and that the Jews of Ethiopia, many of whom were airlifted out of Ethiopia in the 1970s, the Falasha Jews, are the descendants of those advisors who came to Ethiopia almost 3,000 years ago. But that's the story of sort of the Queen of Sheba. And that was the kickoff for the story, but it really wasn't. Really, the kickoff was this whole idea, and I don't know if you want me to get into it now, Mark, the idea of the real location of Jerusalem. Should I get into that now, or do you want to talk more about Sheba?
That's fine. I had it on my quest. Eventually get to it at some point. Why not now?
Yeah. So this is. I mentioned earlier that I waited a while to write the Romerica book. I waited a really long time to write this book because I'd come across this research a long time ago. It's sort of well circulated in the Arab world, but it hasn't really gotten its way out because it's been poo-pooed as being bad research. But I think there's some validity to it. But a lot of Arab sources argue that the original Jerusalem, when I say that, I'm talking about the home of King Solomon's temple, that it was not located in Jerusalem as we know it today, but instead it was located in Western Arabia. Okay, and that so when the original temple was destroyed in the 9th century, I'm sorry. Let me back up for a second. When the original temple was built in the 9th century by King Solomon, that it was not built in Jerusalem, but it was built in Western Arabia, and that only after it was destroyed during the Babylonian exile around 600 BC, and the Israelites were enslaved in Babylon, which was Iraq, really, and then they were eventually freed a couple generations later. Only then did the Israelites settle in modern-day Jerusalem, but that the original settlement of the Jews was in Arabia. So obviously, that if that's true, if that argument is true, it creates a huge geopolitical question today, because, of course, the whole claim that the Jewish people have to the Holy Land is that God promised the Jews that land. And of course, many of the fundamentalist Christians worldwide, and particularly in America, who support Israel and support Israel's right to Jerusalem, base that support on that same argument, that God promised Jerusalem, the Holy Land, to the Jewish people. But if the Holy Land is in Western Arabia and not in Jerusalem, that's a problem, a huge problem. Mm-hmm. And so there's really two main arguments that the supporters of this theory point to. One is that there's, if you read about what King Solomon built, the temple itself was massive and was covered with gold and jewels, and it was really a fabulously ornate building. And Solomon, by the way, was, I think, based on the sources, the richest person the world has ever known. If you take the 10 richest people today and you aggregate their wealth, they still wouldn't be as rich as Solomon was back then. So he built some amazing things, palaces and judiciary buildings, and, of course, his temple, a palace for his wife, incredible stuff. But none of that has been found in Jerusalem. You would think there'd be some evidence of this massive metropolitan area with all these massive buildings in Jerusalem, but there's really nothing. The earliest archaeological record we see of anything going on in Jerusalem is, again, the 6th century, which is after the Babylonian exile. The story is that they left Arabia, they were exiled to Iraq, they were freed, and only then did they go to Israel, to Jerusalem. And that's when we start seeing archaeological record of any kind of significant settlement there. So that's one argument, is the archaeological one. Secondly, is the story of the Queen of Sheba. As I mentioned, this thing called the Kibra Nagast, which is the book that recounts the history of Ethiopia, and it tells the story of Menelik fleeing from Jerusalem with his advisors, with the Ark of the Covenant. And this is where things get interesting, because the Kibra Nagast is very specific about the route that they took. It says that they left Jerusalem, they went to Gaza, they went over to Egypt, they went south, they crossed something called the Brook of Egypt, and they ended up back home. Well, if you look at, and all this took only a couple of days, and if you look at a map, you say, well, that's just impossible. The route doesn't make sense, and the timing doesn't make sense. They would have had to have covered a trip that normally takes 9 days in a single day. And in fact, the Kibra Nagast recognizes that, and the way they get around it is they say that the angels came and helped Menelik flee, and they actually flew, magic carpets, they flew, because otherwise the story doesn't make any sense. But if you look at the story through the eyes of Jerusalem being in Arabia and not in Jerusalem as we know it today, then the story in the Kibra Nagast makes perfect sense, because they go from Jerusalem, we'll call that in Arabia, they go to Gaza. Turns out there's another Gaza, just like in America, every state has a Springfield, and every town has an Elm Street, whatever. The names are reused often. So you go from Jerusalem to Gaza, and then from Gaza to something called Mesrin, Remember earlier I said they went from Jerusalem to Gaza to Egypt. Well, Mezrin is the Middle Eastern name for Egypt. So there's a Mezrin in Arabia. And then you cross the Brook of Egypt, this time going across to Ethiopia as opposed to going from Ethiopia back to Arabia, which is what, if you look at the Kibra Nagas and you follow the path with starting in the traditional Jerusalem, they actually end up crossing back into Arabia when they're done, which makes absolutely no sense. So there's two major problems with the description if you look at the traditional Jerusalem. One, the timing doesn't work, and two, the route makes no sense. They don't end up where they're supposed to be. But if you put Jerusalem in Arabia, the timing makes sense. One day takes 1 day to get there, 1 day's travel is 1 day of time, and you end up back in Ethiopia as opposed to back on the other side of the Red Sea in Arabia. So the Kibra Nagas really supports this idea Jerusalem is in Arabia, not in Israel. So those two arguments. And then there's a third argument. When this book came out in the Arab world, researchers wanted to go to Arabia to check out this area to see if there was any evidence of Solomon's temple, the castles, the palaces, the judiciary centers, all this stuff. Well, the Saudi Arabian government got wind of this and said, and they immediately sent bulldozers down and bulldozed the entire area so that there was no evidence of anything, because they realized it was a hot potato. They probably didn't know whether it was true or not, but the one thing they didn't want was having a tug of war between the Arab world and Israel over this land. And the last thing they wanted to be was put in the middle of another Middle Eastern hot potato. So they just bulldozed everything. So that's sort of been floating around for a while, and it took me a while to really sink my teeth into it. I was asked by a few people not to do it because it's potentially pretty inflammatory. But the evidence is pretty compelling. I even went so far as to look back at the recounts of the Babylonian occupation. So the story is the Babylonians in the 6th century came across and captured Jerusalem and enslaved the Jews and brought them back to Iraq. So I looked at that war, that campaign, and of course it only makes sense. This theory only makes sense if the Babylonians not only took modern Jerusalem, but they also captured the Jerusalem in Arabia, right? If not, then there's no way they would have enslaved the Jews and brought them back. And sure enough, they did. They marched all the way west to the Mediterranean and then headed south and captured a whole rim of Arabia, including where scholars argue the actual Jerusalem is. So that part of the story checked out as well. I was surprised because I thought, I'm going to prove this thing wrong. But no, that part worked out as well. So there's some interesting, again, we're back to the evidence. The evidence indicates that this is a possibility. Long answer. Sorry.
Okay. Well, it's very compelling information, and the map in the book is worth noting, and you have a photo of the St. George Church at Lalibela.
Lalibela, yes.
Yeah. That, and a lot of our listeners or you probably remember seeing it on Ancient Aliens. It's the church below ground. I think that place is really cool.
Yeah. So what's going on there is sort of more evidence that the Templars knew something was going on. Okay, that they figured out something was going on with this whole Jerusalem and Arabia thing, because they kept going back to Ethiopia and trying to, look around. They befriended the Ethiopians. They built these fascinating churches, underground stone churches that were shaped like Templar crosses, including one in, like you just said, Lalibela. And so, and then even after the Templars were put down, the Portuguese, the Knights of Christ, which were sort of the successors in interest to the Templars, they went back a few times as well. But a lot of stuff going on in Ethiopia. The Ark of the Covenant, we think, is there. I mentioned that earlier in the story that Menelik took the Ark of the Covenant, but also evidence that the Templars thought in another area of Ethiopia there was other potential evidence. And again, I think what the Templars were doing, I can't prove this, is that they were in Ethiopia looking for A, for the Ark of the Covenant. That makes sense. But B, also evidence of this whole story that, the Queen of Sheba and Menelik and all this, but that the original Jerusalem might have been in Arabia and not in Israel as we know it today.
Okay. So, one of your settings is at this subterranean St. George Church. You also take us to Chartres Cathedral for the statue of
right. So think about
Bacchus.
this again. These are more little pieces of evidence. So Chartres Cathedral, one of these Gothic cathedrals in France, built by the Templars. So again, in my mind, the Templars know everything because they were the most powerful entity in Europe for a couple hundred years. And the reason they acquired so much knowledge, they went to the Middle East. They were sort of the first Europeans coming out of the Dark Ages to go travel to the Middle East. This is under the guise of the Crusades, of course. But while they were there, they befriended a lot of the local people. They learned a lot. They didn't just come and go. They stayed. While they were there, they would have become privy to much of the knowledge that had been lost to Europe. So anyway, they knew the secrets. At Chartres Cathedral, which was built during the medieval time period, if not built by the Templars, largely influenced by Templars and their supporters, one of the statues that lines the outer perimeter of the cathedral is a statue of the Queen of Sheba. And again, why she's not Christian? Why would she be featured in a Catholic church? She was a pagan. She may have converted or considered converting when she married Solomon, but probably not. There's no evidence of that. At best, she was Jewish, but there's no reason she was Christian. No way. And yet there she is. And again, the question is, what did the Templars know about her? Is there something about her story that ties into the story of Mary Magdalene? There's something going on there, and so I get into that in my book a little bit. But these are the kinds of clues. These are we talked earlier about anomalies. Having the Queen of Sheba on display in a Catholic cathedral makes no sense. All right, so why?
Right.
What are the possibilities? We have a mystery, and now it's our job to figure out what's going on. And so I come up with one possible theory.
Yeah, it's also interesting looking at some of these different churches. The St. George in Ethiopia, it's Christian church. You get Christian church in France that you were just discussing with some statuary that needs some explaining. Throughout almost all your books, you have probably some reference to the Temple of Solomon and the famous tunnels underneath the temple, and you also get these basically tunnels under Oak Island as well, where maybe Covenant was hidden for a while. Other treasures from the Holy Land, but you do discuss the evidence from Oak Island, like the coconut fibers.
Right. All right. So what I'm trying to do, the Oak Island mystery. I think we've all watched the Curse of Oak Island TV show. I was like, I've missed an episode, and I'm looking forward to that starting up again this year, and hoping they're actually going to hit the pay dirt. But the thing about it to me is, again, let's dig deeper and look at some of the evidence. So there are two major pieces of evidence that I think tie this back to the Templars. One is that, let me back up for a second, because one of the theories about Oak Island is that the treasure was buried underground, and that the burial vaults were booby-trapped, so that every time someone dug down to get the treasure, flood tunnels would flood those burial chambers and basically prevent anyone from getting to them. And the way these flood tunnels worked was down at the beach near one end of the island, there are something called box drains that lead to tunnels that lead to the burial chambers. And these box drains are protected from getting clogged up by a layer of coconut fiber. Now, of course, we're up in Nova Scotia, so there's no coconuts that are native to it. So one of the questions is, whoever built these flood tunnels, these box drains, where did they get the coconuts from? They must have come from someplace, some kind of tropical area to have coconuts with them. So, again, we're back to the Templars, who were spending at that time a lot of time in Ethiopia. We just talked about, and there were coconuts in Ethiopia at the time, by the way. But these coconut fibers, not only as part of the show, but also going back 20 or 30 years. Let's see, let me give you, in the early 1990s, 93 and 1990, 1993 in particular, these coconut fibers were sent off to a laboratory to be carbon dated. And 3 different dates came back, 2 back in the 1990s and 1 more recently. But they all come back in the 12th century, 1180, 1130, 1185. And this ties into one of the theories, and Zena Halpern is a researcher who many of your listeners may recognize her name. She wrote a book called The Templar Mission to Oak Island and Beyond, and in that book there is a map which talks about the possibility that the Templars may have visited Oak Island in right around the 1179, 1180 time period. So those carbon dating of those coconut fibers, those dates fit in really nicely with Zena's date and her maps talking about a Templar mission, again, first to Oak Island and then to the Catskills around the time of 1180. And in addition, during the filming of Oak Island, one of the things that came up on the TV show is they found a lead cross on the island, and that lead cross was also dated to the 12th century. So we have, again, a cluster of dates, the coconut fibers, and the lead cross going back to the 12th century. So who in the 12th century would have been building flood tunnels, carrying lead crosses? Who had the technology to do this kind of thing? And really the only candidate during that time period would have been the Templars. They were at the height of their power. They had a fleet of ships. They were excellent navigators. They had access to ancient navigational charts and maps. I think it's entirely possible they would have crossed the Atlantic, probably in search of some kind of safe haven, because they suspected, and their suspicions ended up being proven correct, that at some point the church would turn on them and that they would need some kind of safe haven, which I think is why they first came to America with some of their treasures. But I get into all this in the book, but again, it all gets back to the factual evidence, which is the carbon dating of the coconut fibers, the dating of the lead cross, and this map that Zena produced, which talks about let me get the exact language here, Mark. I don't know if you have it in front of you, but I can pull it up. In French, there's a spot on the map called the vault beneath the earth, which would indicate that there may actually be a treasure buried underneath a spot on that map. So I use all that and weave it together, and along with all the Sheba, the Queen of Sheba stuff, and is Jerusalem in Arabia, and that all winds together and ends up with I think a really fun story. The Sheba's Revenge, I think, is a really fun, interesting historically story.
And with settings like Solomon's Temple, and you can go back to Treasure Templari, where you have all these lists of all the possible artifacts that have been that was the one the Nazis were looking for
yes.
for the artifacts, but all that stuff's right there in the Bible, the Old Testament. It's the writers list everything. It's right there.
What are you talking about? Everything talking about the
Spear of Destiny, or
So right. So this goes back to the question: what is the Templar treasure? What was it that the Templars found when they were digging underneath the Temple of Solomon in the early parts of the 1100s? So Templars went over to Jerusalem around 1120, give or take, and they spent like 10 years basically just digging under the Temple of Solomon, the stables, the horses' stables under the Temple of Solomon. And then whatever they found made them almost instantly incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful. So what was it? Did they find treasure? Did they find religious artifacts? Did they find the Ark of the Covenant? Did they find the Holy Grail? Did they find ancient writings that gave the secrets of Christianity? They used to blackmail the church. Did they find all those things? I mean, it's a number of different possibilities. The Spear of Destiny. I mean, who knows what it might have been that they found, but whatever it was, something they found, and it made them really powerful, really wealthy, really quickly. And then I think it was that same thing that eventually, 200 years later, the church said, you know too much. You're too powerful. You're too wealthy. And you've been hanging this over our head for too long. We're getting tired of being blackmailed. You guys discovered something about Christianity that's not part of our orthodoxy, not part of our dogma. We're afraid you're going to tell people. You guys believe stuff we don't believe in. Maybe that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. Don't know. Something. And the church said, enough. We're done with you guys. And on Friday, the 13th of October, unlucky Friday the 13th, 1307, they rounded up all the Templars and put them on trial, and they outlawed them. But they tried to raid the treasury in Paris, but the Templars had notice of this, and the night before, they spirited all their treasures off to the coast, La Rochelle on the western coast of France. The fleet sailed, and no one's quite sure where it went. Scotland, perhaps, and then off someplace else. And so maybe their treasures left and ended up in America for safekeeping. And that's where a lot of the sort of the legends of Oak Island come in. Did they bury it there to keep it away? At that point, of course, no one really knew how to get to America, so it was out of reach of the Vatican, and that may have been why the Templars brought their stuff over here. But they may have done it even earlier, according to the evidence that I just talked about, the coconut fiber and the lead cross. They may have been over here as early as 1180 or so, getting ready for what they saw as the inevitable conflict with the Vatican.
For portions of your book, you really don't have to invent storylines. The Old Testament just basically gives you an inventory of all the artifacts that were in the Temple of Solomon. You just kind of just weave them into different, where you want to go with them. But the artifacts are already mentioned.
Yeah, and I'm doing that again, Mark. The Old Testament's like a gift that keeps on giving, because there's so many obscure passages in there that people just don't know about. And not just the Old Testament, but something called the Talmud, which is basically the compilation of the teachings of the leading Jewish rabbis during the Middle Ages. So it's basically a commentary on the Old Testament, the Talmud. And the Talmud goes into a lot of detail, not a lot, into some detail about something called the Shamir, Shamir. And the legend is that when God told Solomon to build the Temple of Solomon, he told Solomon, it's a temple of peace, and therefore I do not want you using metal tools, because I'm worried that some of those tools may have at one point been weapons and that were then beat down into tools. And because it's a temple of peace, we don't want that. So you have to figure out a way how to build this temple without using any metal tools. Well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to split stone? It was marble and granite and whatever. How are you going to split stone without metal tools? And so Solomon had heard of something called the Shamir, which was a magic stone-cutting worm. And he captured the demon Asmodeus, who he had heard knew where this worm was. And he captured Asmodeus, and he basically convinced, he pried the information out of Asmodeus. Asmodeus told him where to find the worm. Solomon sent his guys out to get the worm. They brought the worm back, and the worm is what he used to build the temple, again, without metal tools. And so this Shamir is something I'm writing about now. That's my next novel. But again, this all goes back to stuff that was stories of building the temple. In modern-day Israel, when the Orthodox Jews talk about rebuilding the temple, and they want to rebuild it the same way it was built the first time, same specifications, and same restrictions, they want to find the Shamir. It's lost, by the way, to history, so they can rebuild it again. So, of course, in my story, the mystery is: have we found the Shamir? Is the Shamir missing? Can we find it again? People want to find it for various reasons. Partly because it may be, is it radioactive? Is it a laser? Is it some kind of alien technology, or is it really just something that's God created as part of, there was a time period after the sixth day and before the seventh day when he rested where God invented or created things that sort of a catch-all, I'll give you some examples of things that really can't be explained in other ways. Let me see if I can find some of them here. There's like 14 of them, I think.
It's like
one
Bigfoot and Mothman.
Yeah, seriously. One of them was like iron tongs, because one can't forge tongs in fire without first having a pair of tongs to hold them with. So therefore, God must have created the first pair of tongs to give to humans so they can make more. That make sense?
Okay.
Okay.
I like it.
Yeah. So there were 12 different things that manna from heaven. That's a common one. Let me see here. The Ten Commandments. Staff of Moses, the Shamir. Anyway, so these are things. There's a bunch of. These are things that God created on the sixth day before He rested on the seventh day, that can't otherwise be explained. But the burial grave of Moses, because Moses went off and died on his own, right? Well, he couldn't have buried himself, so God had to dig his grave for him. Okay, that kind of stuff. So stuff that can't otherwise be explained in the Old Testament. The Talmud has this list of things that God must have created between the sixth and seventh days. Strange list. Combination of mundane and extraordinary. Demons is another one. The demons.
That's a perfect topic for Nightlight.
It's interesting to sit around one night, back in college, having a couple beers, saying well, who made the first pair of tongs? Okay, it's yeah, it sort of makes sense because you need a pair of tongs to hold the tongs to put them in the fire. Otherwise, how do you put them in the fire? So. Okay.
But just let me know before you call George and say you want to be on his show.
Of course I will. The ram that appeared to Abraham telling him not to sacrifice Isaac. That's another one of those God thinks God created on that sixth day. So the whole fun list. But the Shamir is a really cool, like a magic little worm that built Solomon's temple. So, like you said, the Solomon's temple is a gift that keeps on giving. It's just everything, because the temple, of course, and the name, the Templar name comes from the Temple of Solomon. That's what the Templars are named after. So of course, that's where they started. That's where they lived. That's where whatever they became powerful. That's where they found it. And so poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. That's their name.
Okay, one of the things I like about your canon of books is all the contrasts that you create. Like we're talking about the tunnels under the temple and tunnel under Oak Island, and the Serpent Oracle. We were talking about the Hill Kumara and the Hilltop Fortress in Ohio, where you have some of this a few scenes there. Obviously there we already went through all the snake imagery around the world, and you have the eels in the nostophilia. I actually went back through notes. Yeah, because I kept forgetting the word on another that word on another show. But so you have the eels swimming out to where Atlantis was, and then
in the sea, the Sargasso Sea, in the middle, off the coast of in the Atlantic, in the Atlantic, basically, So the idea that the eels swim out there from America and from Europe, and they meet to spawn out there, which is nostophilia, like you said. It's the compulsion to return to their native habitat, their original homeland. The eels want to go home, and so they swim back out to they're freshwater eels, but they swim out to the middle of the ocean. And the idea is that at some point that there was land there that was fresh water above the ocean, and they lived in lakes there. And eventually, at some point, that land collapsed, and the eels swam off. But they go back there every year to spawn. Nostophilia, as you said, Mark. But so I had eels, I had snakes, now I got worms. I got
and
crawly things.
The Shamirs. So what do you have to say about all these kind of cryptozoological creatures and other creatures out of folklore? It's a running theme.
Yeah. So again, I write about what I find. So as an example, at Roslyn Chapel in let me just find it. In Scotland, of course, the famous Roslyn Chapel. There is something called the Apprentice Pillar, and I think most of your listeners are probably familiar with that. It's probably the most prominent thing as you go in there. It's very ornate, but the bottom of this, or at the base, there's a whole bunch of intertwined worms that sort of circle the base, which people don't really pay much attention to. Their eyes go up, but again, so is that sort of a nod? The probably don't have time to get into it too deep, but in Freemasonry, there's a whole story about how the Shamir plays an important part in some of the Masonic initiation, first-degree rituals, okay? The snake is the Shamir with Hiram Abiff and whatnot, and the Apprentice Pillar relates to the story of Hiram Abiff, and so it may be that those worms on the pillar at Roslyn Chapel are a reflection of that Masonic degree ritual work. So that may be what's going on with that the worms are a reflection or a symbol of the Shamir. So that's maybe what's going on there. So, it's not so much that I'm looking for this stuff, but there it is. Why in a Christian chapel, which is what Rosslyn Chapel is, why do we have worms? All right, there's a mystery. I mean, it's not the type of thing usually you see in a church. So what's going on there? These are the questions you have to ask, and now we're looking for answers. And I always say I may not have it right, but there is a story behind those worms, and I'm offering one possibility, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, but someone else has got to come up with a story that explains them, and it can't be, they're just worms. That's not good enough. There's a reason there's worms there. What's the story behind it?
Yeah, so I think this has been a terrific lead-in to a show we'll be doing about 6 weeks or so on John Hughes's The Healing Practices of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller. And Hospitalier. Okay. And he does talk about, we will be getting into Muslim Arabs who at the time would have been considered the most advanced medical practitioners in the world.
Definitely.
Arab medical science had already been established for more than 1,500 years, and the Crusaders just had, most of the people, back home in Europe had no idea how to cure basic things, but when the Crusaders came back, just a wealth of knowledge, and it's really interesting when you and some of the other Templar scholars or guests, it really becomes a fascinating subject of how much they really accomplished.
Yeah, so we always think today. I know we're getting near the end here, Mark. We think today as being the Arab world as being a little bit backward, and but back then, Europe was in the Dark Ages and had very little knowledge or education. Most of the knowledge and education was in the Arab world back then, and so when the Templars and other Crusaders went to the Middle East, they learned a lot. They brought a lot back, and that was sort of the roots of the Enlightenment period in Europe. Had it not been for the knowledge that was acquired during that time period, Europe may never have gotten out of the Dark Ages. And the church is perfectly happy with people being ignorant, because again, that meant instead of going to the doctor to get cured, you went to church and prayed for a cure, and you put money in the what's it called, the collection box. So they were happy with that arrangement. They were happy with people being basically ignorant and just praying for what they wanted, because that kept them in business. So, that was part of the issue with the Templars as well. The Templars were interested in science and learning and understanding and knowledge, and again, the church didn't necessarily want people to be acquiring forbidden knowledge. It goes back to that. We don't want people being too smart. We like them being like sheep, just following what we say.
Mm-hmm. Time to say goodnight, Mark.
Okay, there's the voice. Okay, so thanks, David. Check out David's books on Amazon. We'll see everyone next week with Max Hawthorne. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. Good night.